everyone, welcome to the Stoa. I'm Amy Wollaston. I am a writer and adjunct professor in New York, and I'm here today to host Part Moon, Part Traveling Salesman on the enduring relevance of Ivan Illich. And we are here to talk to David Cayley. David Cayley is a Canadian writer and broadcaster known for documenting the philosophy of prominent thinkers of the 20th century, including most notably Ivan Illich, and his work was broadcast on CBC Radio 1's program Ideas for more than 30 years. And this year he published Ivan Illich, An Intellectual Journey. Hi, David.
Hi, Amy.
How are you?
I'm well, thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to start interrogating David on his new book. And anybody who would like to ask David a question, please put your questions into the chat. After about 20 or 30 minutes of dialogue, we will be calling on people and you will get one question and one follow-up question. So to begin, David, this book is amazing. It's beautiful. I've been poring over it. I mean, it's more than 500 pages, so I have not gotten through it. It's quite dense. It's quite intellectually dense, but the writing is actually very easy to get through. It's like sitting down to eat a hot fudge sundae. It's so beautifully smooth and delicious. What brought about the writing of this book, and how long did it take you?
Wow. Well, 75 years, maybe it took me, but 5 years directly of writing. I left the CBC in 2012 and did some work on subjects that I felt I needed to do work on, and then spent about 5 years actually writing the book. But its origin lies in an earlier book called The Rivers North of the Future, which was a conversation I had with Ivan Illich in the late 90s, which was published, which became a CBC radio series, but was published after his death, and embodies what he called his research hypothesis. So he clearly intended it as a sketch of a body of ideas that needed to be developed, that he hoped others would develop. So I dared to call it a testament that he had left, and I took it as such. And so, although my book isn't just about those ideas, it's about his whole intellectual career. I'm sorry to say the word. Maybe career isn't quite the right word. His whole...
I don't think he would like that word, David.
Yeah, no, I don't think you would either. But the whole scope of his work, and to a certain extent also his life, since his way of life was relevant to his work. So yeah, the seeds of the book lie in the earlier book, The Rivers North of the Future.
And the seeds of that, I would say, I mean, you were introduced to Illich's work in what, 1968?
1969.
Okay.
Yes, very close. Yeah. I was
and then you met him subsequently 9 years, 10 years later?
Well, we brought him to Toronto in 1970 for a big teach-in.
Okay.
A group of us had organized. It was sort of the last of the big teach-ins that were features of the 60s at the University of Toronto. It was called Crisis in Development. So it was about the crisis of the idea of international development, or more generally of one form of development, all nations on one road leading to the shining city. And he was our featured speaker. So we met then, but we didn't become closely connected until much, much later in the 1980s, when he was writing on the history of literacy and came to a conference at the University of Toronto in 1987.
And this kind of kicked off, I mean, I don't want to call it a bromance, but it was certainly a significant relationship for you. You traveled to Penn State and also to Mexico to dialogue with Illich, am I correct?
Yes, that's true. Yes, it started with 8 days of interview in State College, Pennsylvania, a little town in the dead center of Pennsylvania where I never expected to become attached, but have become very attached. And then continued. I became part of his milieu, which was a very interesting milieu, and it led me into many other paths, broadcasting paths, since I trusted him. And if he said, go and see Nils Christie in Norway or go and see John McKnight in Chicago, I was obedient and did what he said and was never disappointed, and made many new friends, and shared a lot of that with Canadian radio listeners. So yes, but he had Ivan ran a kind of alternative university on the margins of existing universities. And so we were often, me and mine were often present at these living room conversations, as they were called, in State College, and then later in Bremen in Germany. So yes, we saw as much of each other as was possible, given both the constraints of both our lives.
And did you ever feel, because I mean, Illich is kind of just, even in like Encyclopedia Britannica, he's described as a radical philosopher. And obviously some of his ideas, I think Deschooling Society particularly have been very much, I mean, it's still considered radical, but it's much more, you know, it's an acceptable mode of thinking about the world, more so probably than it was when it first came out. Do you feel like your book, I think in your book you say recently Giorgio Agamben, the philosopher, said that Illich's work is finally reaching the hour of its legibility. Do you feel like your book kind of coincides with that? And what do you feel about this idea of Illich being a radical thinker versus a, you know, maybe a visionary thinker, or somebody whose ideas were perhaps a little ahead of their time? Or
well, that's quite a complicated question. I certainly think the word radical fits. When his friend Erich Fromm introduced his first book, Celebration of Awareness, he called him a radical humanist. Various other names would apply, but he was certainly a radical thinker, in as much as he said in those books of the early 1970s, which ranged from Deschooling Society through to Medical Nemesis, that he felt Western or modern societies were reaching a watershed beyond which they would descend into a kind of chaos, which he called radical counterproductivity or paradoxical counterproductivity. In other words, if a limit was not found to the growth of schools, to the growth of hospitals, to the growth of medicine, to the ambitions of the law, to the transportation system, across the board, he called for a constitution of limits, and that call was essentially not heeded, although, as you said, many people picked up the ideas, and Deschooling was an important book in the various movements. His friend and associate, John Holt, to take one example, started a network which he called Growing Without Schooling, and obviously it was in that lineage. But overall, his call went completely unheeded, and things unfolded as he predicted they would. So the hour that he would have liked to be the hour of his legibility was the time that he made those calls, and it wasn't to be. So he reaches the hour of his legibility now, to keep on with the phrase that Agamben borrows from Walter Benjamin, is, yes, now the chaos is perceptible. It's a kind of apocalyptic, if you want, coming again of the notes that he sounded then. So yes, he's legible, but not in the way he would have wished to be.
Yeah, and I mean, do you feel, because your book is, I mean, you state quite, clearly that it's not a biography, although it does contain biographical information. It is sort of like it's just packed with ideas, but it's packed with both Illich's ideas and your ideas related to his work, but also your ideas that kind of expand beyond his work. So do you feel like your book is sort of a compendium or I mean, how would you describe this, or what was the intention of this book at the end of the day?
Well, to continue my conversation with Ivan and with his ideas. So he, at the end of the interviews he recorded in 1998 in State College, Pennsylvania, he shocked me. I had prepared myself diligently for the interview, in as much as I had read everything that he had published. And at the end, I found out that I, in a certain sense, had missed the boat when he said that he felt the whole history of the West could be summed up in the old adage, corruptio optimi pessima, the corruption of the best is the worst, which indeed is a proverb. You can find it in Aquinas, you can find it in Shakespeare, you can probably find it in Marcus Aurelius, since we're in a Stoic place. But I had no idea what he meant, let alone that this would sum up the entire history of the civilization which I belonged to. And so I thought my way into that idea with him over many years. Finally, when I realized he was never going to write the book I wanted, pressed him to talk to me and in effect dictate that book to me, which he did. That was the book that I mentioned earlier, which became The Rivers North of the Future. And still, it was only a sketch, a brilliant, eloquent, deeply moving sketch, but still a sketch. So I felt I wanted to go on with it, and I wanted to show how all his work cohered. So in a certain sense, to show who he was, who he had been, and what he might have to say to people today. And, you know, when Charles Taylor, the Canadian philosopher, contributed a preface to The Rivers North of the Future, and that was a huge moment in the history of my book, also in the history of Ivan's reputation, because Ivan had fallen in a certain way out of sight. So, I mean, when he died in 2002, for example, the New York Times headed their obituary, radical priest who appealed to baby boomers in the 70s. Okay, so yesterday's man, right? That's over. And there was a lot of that. There was a lot of mythology and legend, but not much that would make you feel this was a contemporary philosopher, theologian, thinker. And Taylor said, well, this is a unique body of thought, because it isn't the idea that the modern West can be understood of the perversion of Christianity moves exactly between the normal poles of discussion, either pro or for or against, right? Either conservative, or if you like, reactionary defense of the Christian tradition, or renunciation of the Nietzschean renunciation of that tradition. Taylor found a unique position, and I think it is a unique position in as much as it encourages us to look in contemporary institutions, in contemporary rituals, in contemporary patterns of thought and action for the traces of the Roman Catholic Church, of the Latin Christian Church. And that also encourages us to reach before that institution to ask what might have been. It invites a re-interrogation, a retrieval, if you want, of the past. And I think it's to say it's unique to him is probably wrong, but it's distinctive in him.
Right. And you, I mean, you say in the book, I believe it's, I'm quoting you, modernity, it was Christianity turned inside out. And do you still believe that? And do you believe that Illich kind of exemplifies that theory in his work?
I do. I do. I mean, he used, that's one of his expressions,
Oh,
inside
okay.
out. And what does it mean, really?
Yeah.
Topsy-turvy. He tried to say all these, he had tried all these different ways of saying what perversion also says, but perversion is a hard word. But yes, inside out is an interesting image for me, right? Yes. So yes, I believe that. I think that his hypothesis that modernity can be studied as an extension of church history is a very, very fruitful hypothesis.
Yeah. So do you think that Illich was doing like a modernist reformation, like is in kind of like treating it almost like a religion that needed kind of fixing?
Well, he never said that. His quite good friend Paul Goodman did say that. Goodman wrote a book that Ivan admired called New Reformation Notes of a Neolithic Conservative. And I can remember Ivan saying that if anybody forced him to declare a political position, that he would admit to anarchism if forced, but that he would prefer Goodman's term, Neolithic conservative. So he clearly liked and admired Paul Goodman's book, and they were quite good friends. And so, yes, I think he was very much interested in a new Reformation, though he never named it that.
And speaking of which, I mean, what I find fascinating about this book is the fact that you are dedicated to Illich's thought, not in a kind of, you know, you're dedicated to its complexity. There's many times in this book that you critique Illich and you critique his lack of understanding of his own work. In some ways, his lack of understanding of the way in work it was received. I must admit that I jumped to the gender chapter just because I was really fascinated to understand that work through what you thought of it. So did you feel like that was important to not simply explicate this work, but also provide a critique almost from the inside of it?
Yes, I think that's probably right. I mean, we argued sometimes. We didn't agree about everything, and friends do have such discussions. And I do think gender, to take that example, was a tragic misunderstanding, which he may have, in a certain sense, blundered into. But when you're doing something that new and you're that excited about it, maybe blundering is the only way to get anywhere, right? If you were so careful, you might just stay home. So yes, but yes, it's true. There are some criticisms.
There are, yeah. And I mean, specifically, I don't want to get too much, I mean, because I don't know how many people have actually read the whole book. I have not actually read the whole book just because it does require a lot of dedication because you're bringing up so many different ideas. But specifically with that chapter, what I found fascinating was that there was this idea that Illich was almost not writing from the standpoint of himself or as a man, but kind of trying to take this more expansive sort of a meta view and a more complete historical view, and that seemed to not have landed very well with the audience at the time that it was published. Do you think that again Agamben, I think, said that book is right, you know, he republished it, I believe, in Italy, and you know, was saying that it was ripe for reevaluation essentially. Do you feel like that work specifically could have an audience now that it may not have had in the time that it was published?
Yes, I do. But I think that audience will have to do a fair amount of work because the language has changed, right? It was Ivan's belief, and it may be true, that he was the one who first gave the term gender prominence. He remembered going to his publisher, Pantheon, and who brought out the book Gender, and them saying, well, gender, that's the article you put in front of the noun, isn't it? Nobody knows what gender is, right? The term wasn't in play. One had a sex, but not really a gender until later, right? And in the feminist genealogy, it's now attributed to another historian writing in 1985. Ivan has been written out of the record, and his term has been changed, so it doesn't mean what he meant by it. So the term, as let's say Judith Butler deploys it for the performative aspects of sex, is completely different than what he meant. So he was, this is complicated, and I don't want to take too much time over, but he was on a trajectory in the late 70s, early 80s, when he did this work to try to understand the idea of scarcity. So his book is in many ways an essay in economic history. It was not understood as that. It was understood as essentially a call to get back to the kitchen girls, which I think he didn't even imagine that could have been how it would be interpreted, because he was really talking about gender as a bulwark against, which is broken by capitalism, which finally allows universal circulation of everything, in effect. So the way he wanted to construct the discussion, the things he meant, all maybe now will be intelligible to some readers, yes, but only if they're willing to really rethink this whole question.
Yeah, I mean, at the time, that argument, I think, was extremely personalized by the people that were vocally against Illich's work, or that part of Illich's work. And you state that Illich was trying to derail the gravy train while his opponents were finally trying to claim a decent seat, which I think is, I think that's probably true. You know, there was the idea of the feminist movement being a movement about equality in economic distribution, right, was a huge part. Yeah. So I do think that there is a time for this work now. I think it would be really interesting for it to have its moment in the sun and be understood as Illich wanted it to be. But you state that it's, Illich was interested in potentially producing a history of scarcity. And then you also say, and this I find really fascinating, at the end of the book, you say, you conclude by stating that Illich's one thought, which is paraphrasing Heidegger's belief that every thinker thinks only one thought, is complementarity. Can you explain a little bit about what you mean by complementarity?
I can try. Let's start, you go back to the early 70s, right? Ivan wasn't against schools as such. He ran a school in Mexico, a very fine language school. He was all for schools insofar as they served some practical purpose. He was against the radical monopoly of compulsory education. He was against all monopolies, all radical monopolies, as he called them. Essentially, the word radical there just says it prevents you from doing it any other way, right? If the freeway cuts you off from the people on the other side of your neighborhood, you're disabled. You can't get there, right? If you want to get a job emptying garbage cans and you haven't got grade 12, you can't get the job. It has nothing to do with your capacity to empty the can into the truck. That's a radical monopoly, right? You can only do it our way. There is no other way. It's our way or the highway. So in all cases, he sees societies crossing a threshold, right? A point of balance. He doesn't imagine a world in which there is no institution, in which everything is spontaneous. He imagined a world in which institutions are balanced by a vital vernacular, was the term he eventually tried to put into play, not very successfully, but whatever arises from people, right? In in Tools for Conviviality, which is the central work of that period, he lays out 3 conditions for recovery, as he calls it. And recovery means what some deep ecologists call reinhabitation, a viable, limited human way of life that could last. And he said, one of them, he says, is to overcome the delusion about science. So he's not imagining the end of science. He's imagining not a total monopoly of one mode of thought, right? Or the recovery of language, he says. So that spontaneous language coined by people in their communities on the ground and not immediately minted as some new lingo that you can buy or that's on your t-shirt or that's coming from the radio station. Whatever it is, he imagines that sphere. So there's always contrasting spheres, right? The point of balance, the point of equilibrium is always crucial. And I think in the same way, if you come to the Christian proclamation, which is so much institutionalized, right, that it becomes sin, as he says, is criminalized, right? The whole proclamation is turned into a system, to speak very bluntly and plainly, and probably without much nuance. So again, the balance has been lost, right? And so that's how I came to this idea of complementarity, which of course is my idea. He has some very nice words about complementarity and gender and elsewhere, but it's definitely the thought I've been thinking all my life, and which has been highlighted in my dialogue with him.
So do you think you have another book in you that might be more related to that in your own kind of thesis of it?
Yeah, God willing.
Okay.
Yes.
Good. I'm glad.
Yes.
I'm glad. So I have.
But
I've
also thought it would, it might be Illich for Dummies might be a good idea as well.
I think your book is so beautifully written that I am sure dummies and smarties alike can get something out of it.
Well, I don't really mean Illich for Dummies. I mean, we talked about Charles Taylor, who did a 800-page book on Hegel and then boiled it down into a beautiful 230-page book called Hegel and the Modern World. And would that he could do that with a secular age, but it's too late now. But that's what I'm talking about. This book could potentially be a shorter book, which would, not everyone's going to read a book this long.
True. So I have, before we open it up to questions from our fellow Stoans, I wanted to ask you, in the book you quote Illich as saying, you can't write a biography of friendship, it's too intimate. Do you feel like because what you present in this book is quite intimate in some ways, but also very expansive. Do you agree with him? And I know you don't see this as a biography, but there are biographical aspects of it.
Yes, I was governed by that insight throughout, and I think it's right. I mean, we live in an age in which how many biographies, 800-page, 600-page biographies are published every week, right? And how many of their authors have come to dislike their subject, and how many of them have this pretension to have an overview of the subject, right? As if the writer could actually see the soul of the other one. And that just was inimical to Ivan's whole way of thought and way of life, right? He said, no one knows really finally what is between any two. It's shaded from all others because it's between them. He was completely devoted to what emerges between one and the other in the moment. He was about celebration, as he called his first book, Celebration of Awareness, but he was also about celebration, Eucharistic celebration in community. So there's no way for me to get above him. And my whole ambition is in a certain way to get below him, as he says, to understand. And he says that also, that one has to be below the other and recognize the distance, the gulf that is between us, right? Then only then do we recognize our likeness with each other, our similarity, what can then join us. But he says to get to that place, you have to jettison modern languages, whether they're Marxian or Freudian, that tell you that you can identify the false consciousness of the other. You are the one who knows, the other doesn't know. And so you construct them according to the stereotypes that you make up. But he wasn't interested in any of that.
Beautiful. Okay, so we're going to open it up to questions. If I call on you and you're not interested in being on YouTube, just indicate and I will read your question for you. But I would like to start off with Benita's question.
Hi, thanks so much. I read your book. I read everything that you write. And I could ask you 100,000 questions. I just want to reflect back that I think what you've done here is extraordinary, not only because of the kind of intellect he was, but just what you said at the end, that you honored your relationship. It's not an overview book. It's not a summary of the thought of Ivan Illich. What you've done is extraordinary. So I just wanted to thank you for that. My comment is, I'm going to ask you about systems thinking. Mm-hmm. I think, so one of the things about Ivan Illich is that people will read Deschooling and then they're like, oh yeah, that's who he is, like the hippies get behind him. And then, your book is filled with these left-hand turns. Oh, he's very religious, but he's this, and I think it's an extraordinary example. I mean, he reminds me of like Bob Dylan when people tried to project that he cared about Vietnam, and then Dylan didn't really care. And then he also reminds me of Thomas Merton. It's like these figures who are iconic, but they're not archetypal. Like you can't quite reduce them. They're irreducible presences. And I think your book shows that. So the irreducible point I want to ask you about, which kind of blew my mind, is that, he talks on you quote him on page 250 as coming out of the spell of Gregory Bateson in systems thinking. And I think this is hugely important right now, because many people, developmental theory people, they see the future is creating more systems thinking in health, systems thinking, and like Latour says, don't think of the earth as a system, whether you think of it as a machine or a giant vegetable, it's still reducing it. And Graham Harman said it's called overmining. You're not reducing, you're overmining, so that the subject disappears, right?
Right.
And
right.
so can you say, you could unpack that, but what was his critique of systems thinking?
Okay. Well, he was enamored of cybernetic thinking. That's which, if we can make those synonyms for now. And he was good friends with a number of people who were prominent in that movement. They were hosted in Cuernavaca, where he had his center, CDOC. And you can see the traces of it in Deschooling Society in the last chapter, Learning Webs. So he's enthusiastic initially about the potential of computers. And people who became quite prominent, Humberto Maturana, Francisco Varela, were there in CDOC in the early 70s. And then he began to feel at the beginning of the 80s that something was going on in his world that he had not expected to see, a transition deeper, more profound than anything he had thought possible, and that really undermined. I'm sorry about the telephone. I can't do anything about it. It'll just have to ring itself out. So can we wait?
I love it because that happens to me all the time because I have a landline.
I
also.
should have unplugged it. My wife went out and I forgot to unplug it. So there it is. So he came to this, and that he felt it undermined everything he had said in a certain way in the early 70s, because he had really conceived all these institutions as tools, gigantic tools to be sure, but still within an instrumental or technological frame in which you could imagine that people would confront something that he, let's say in medical nemesis, calls the medical establishment, and change it. And I think how he perceived this new mode of thought was that people were now established within systems. The primary thought of systems theory is that I'm part of the system, right? And there's no place to stand outside it. It's a radical immanence, to take a fancy word for it. And that, I think the primary element of that for him was disembodiment. What he came to call disembodiment, right? That you, in thinking of yourself in systems terms, you think of yourself intellectually. You really subtract your personal presence. You're being this one, this unique one. So the element of person is disappearing for him. And that's a very short answer, but I think that's the crucial thought. That's and when you mentioned Bateson, I mean, I have an old friend who greatly admires Bateson. And I would say that what this friend has taken out of Bateson is entirely compatible with what Ivan is thinking. So, it's a typing of a body of thought, not really about Gregory Bateson as such. And similarly with a lot of the cybernetic thinkers with whom he was friends or in sympathy, So.
Just one quick question. Do you know if Ivan knew the process philosopher educator Donald Oliver?
I don't know. I don't know him myself, and I don't know if he knew him.
Okay, thank you very much.
Nice to meet you.
Thanks, Benita. So we have a question from Peter, or several, whichever one you choose, Peter.
Oh, Peter Jones. I think I did post a couple. In fact, I had another that I didn't yet. So really, and I want to say Amy too, what a delightful interview. And David, this has just been really, generous and thoughtful. I've learned a lot with this, and I haven't read the book. I'm a design professor at OCAD University. We teach design research, research methods for design using Liz Sanders's book, Convivial Toolbox. And Liz Sanders, from Ohio State. I know her from Ohio, and there's been this kind of movement in design that probably goes back maybe 15 years now of learning from Ivan Illich's ideas and kind of working them into the tools of design and for democratic participation. It's a movement for conviviality, for design research, with the engagement of people that are going to be, in essence, constructing the tools that they will use, a type of participatory design and a and a Western rethinking of that. And I can't, and so when I teach this, when I bring these ideas, and I can't help but see the gap between kind of even Illich's intent to change culture, in a sense, that the tools are part of a larger project of, can we influence, can we change, can we recover culture? And we're not doing that. We're just getting more and more caught up in technocracy, and we're even using convivial tools that get then adopted into things like service design in government that becomes technocratic and things like that. I mean, so we're making a difference, but it's at a means, not ends. And my question is about, where we see the movement towards a convivial anti-technocracy. Where have the ideas really have his ideas been meaningfully taking shape in ways that we're seeing, a counter movement against the just massive, just radical increase in even the technocracy we had, just in the whole approach toward COVID. Medical nemesis has been like, kind of the counterweight to the entire process of the COVID response. And I don't see anybody working with those ideas or bringing them up or willing to stand up, to a kind of convivial world or in this sense. So, who's on the vanguard of this now? I mean, we're kind of older people that remember and work with these ideas to the best extent we can. But how can we recover the intent to change culture?
Well, the question, who's on the vanguard, is, I think, really up for grabs. Because, I mean, I don't want to presume too much. I don't even know who I'm talking to, really. But I have been very, very disturbed by the COVID crisis. By the, first of all, censorship in the media, including the CBC. Only one story allowed. All dissent typed as misinformation or disinformation. People literally not allowed, even old sources of the CBCs, for example, the former chief medical officer of health for Ontario, Richard Chavis, deplatformed instantly when he said something that didn't fit the story. So we've got a censorship, we've got scientific dissent pushed to the margins or eliminated or also typed as misinformation. So we've got a construction of the crisis which was so astonishingly hyperbolic that I'm amazed nobody saw it. Just constant pushing of numbers and fear and the whole way in which it was done. And we've got radical uncertainty. So you've got a test, the PCR test, which you don't know what it diagnoses, but it tells everybody what the case numbers are. You have, you don't know how many have died of COVID because they may have just died with COVID. You can't, you really, there's radical uncertainty about what has happened. Certainly, almost all the people I know do not have I think, a realistic or proportionate estimate of what's going on. So, and this has been a truly frightening stampede in which people are willing to deprive their neighbors of civil rights. They're vindictively denying you unemployment insurance, now called employment insurance, to the people who are being fired because they don't wish to be vaccinated. So I think this is a moment at which there will have to be political realignment. And I don't know who will be the vanguard, but there are, in almost every institution, in almost every place, there are courageous people who are speaking against this, who are on the whole not being heard except in certain venues. I mean, to tell you how bad this is, I wrote an article in 2020, late in the year, for the Literary Review of Canada, raising some of these concerns. That article had to be vetted by the entire board before they dared to publish it. So this is really a kind of a stampede that we're in. And I think it's gonna create political realignments, but I would certainly not presume to say how they're going to go. Does that answer? Does that answer at all?
It opens it up for me. I mean, I really see the potential for leaning into Ivan Illich and his Catholic anarchic perspective, as was I mentioned in also in another post in the chat, like Jacques Ellul, who criticized propaganda and la technique, technocracy,
yes,
in very similar ways. I mean, they were. I read both of them as, you know, as very influential in the ways that we're approaching what we call systemic design. So design for large-scale systems in ways that can restore humanity in those systems. And so there, but then also the other leg of this is the recovery of the Catholic theology. I mean, Bruno Latour was a Catholic theologian, and his whole philosophy is then, you know, has been perhaps above a lot of these issues, but it subsumes them, and perhaps he's the contemporary among the Catholic theologians who express a philosophy that affects technology and science, and the thinkers in tech and science today. Latour is very credible in speaking about the nature of Gaia and the critical zone that we're engaged in, the ways that we are, you know, the ways that we've separated ontologies, our different ways of living in modernism, and that restrict us from speaking to each other effectively and for collaborating well. And these were the same concerns I think Liz Sanders had within design, to create a more convivial approach to design. So like Liz, I make tools and create tools for thinking and design education, but I'm interested in essentially in the same type of culture change. And so that's, can we lean on Illich I mean, as a way to, you know, can we kind of build some credibility from you even, I wonder, to say that these are enduring ideas, and there's also kind of the Christian virtues, the Catholic virtues of solidarity, subsidiarity, and preferential option. Or, you know, I think when we speak about the COVID response, those are eradicated. I mean, we can at least speak from virtues, and we could, you know, try. I'm just looking for ways that we can elevate the conversation and try to wake people up. And there's some, you know, and I'll look to the philosophers to help me with that.
Well, this is more than we can do here, but I mean, I have a lengthy essay, it's on my website, on Illich and Latour, which I wrote following my reading of Bruno Latour's Gifford lectures, where Facing Gaia. And Illich, Gaia was a symbol for Ivan of cybernetic thought, right? It was a symbol of a new paganism. There was any number of ways in which he reprobated the image of Gaia, and we argued about it again and again, because I didn't have the same view that he did. So I think Illich and Latour is a fascinating study, because there are elements in Latour that I think Illich corrects for, and probably there are elements in the vice versa as well, right? So I mean that one of the great ideas I take from Latour is peacemaking, right? Is peacemaking by recognizing real difference, right? And then trying to come to terms with it. And I think that's also the inspiration for the website that we're speaking on, right? The Stoa is also has a vision, maybe not explicitly in these terms, but of peacemaking, right? Of actually respectful discussion. I mean, there's a lot to talk about, right? And that's one of the reasons why it's so terrifying to face a censorship at the CBC, where I worked all my life, at exactly the time when you think, wouldn't this be the place to open up conversations? Wouldn't this be the time for critical consideration of where things are at now? Not a time for cheerleading and persecution of the dissidents. So, yeah, I mean, I'm just batting my gums here, but I think there's a lot to be said on the score on the themes that you've broached.
Thank you for joining us at the Stoa. This is a place that I come to find dialogue as well.
Right.
So yeah, we find it where we have it. Thank you.
All right.
David, have you done a public dialogue with Latour?
Yes, I interviewed him a number of times, and
Recently?
There's a story actually to it, which he got pretty mad at me. When he published We Have Never Been Modern, a book that I found quite thrilling to read, he came to Toronto at the invitation of Ian Hacking, and it was a seminar which I was invited to take part in, and I excitedly interviewed Bruno, and it was all good, I thought, until my executive producer said, nobody's going to understand that. Bruno Latour can speak English better than I can, but he does have an accent, and it was new ideas in an accented voice, and it was the judgment of my superior that couldn't be broadcast. So I had to write to Bruno and say, well, you've been canceled. he was pretty mad about it, but he got over it. And there is, in a series called How to Think About Science, there's a section with Bruno Latour, yes. And I'm a long time reader and of Latour, and very interested in his work.
Same. So Janice has a question. Janice, would you like to ask your question? Janice?
I think she requested to read it.
Okay, okay. So I will read Janice's question. Let me just get to that point. Okay, my question is from the radio program Corruption of Christianity. Illich talked about living in apocalyptic times, and the best response was friendship, or something like that. I was wondering what he meant by friendship in that context, not his own friendships.
Well, that's a pretty big question. What he meant by friendship is making room for the other one, responding to the other one, not, as I said earlier, standing above the other one. I think he finally, the text to which he reverted again and again was a book from the 12th century called On Spiritual Friendship by Aelred, who was the abbot of the monastery of Rievaulx, which is present-day Yorkshire, in which he begins, here we are, he's addressing a brother monk in this treatise. He says, here we are, you and I hope another, a third, I think he says, and I hope a third, who is Christ. So obviously that enters into Ivan's understanding of friendship. But what he means about present times, he also told a story about a conversation with Romano Prodi, who was the brother of one of his old friends and who was then the prime minister of Italy. This is in the mid-90s, and Romano approached Ivan after a talk and said, isn't what you said a continuation of prophecy for our time? And Ivan very explicitly said, no, not prophecy, right? The time of the prophets is over. It's a question now of friendship. If we take the vocation of the friend as a transposition of the vocation of the prophet, then I think that's how he understood it. But I think that depends finally on an idea of incarnation, that what was in the mouth of the prophets, the words that were in the mouths of the prophets, are now in the flesh, is between us, should we be able to discover it in one another. So I think his whole conception of politics probably also finally rests on friendship. So it is absolutely central in every way to his thought.
Beautiful. So I think we have come to the top of the hour. David, did you have anything you would like to close out with?
Well, not right off the top of my head, no, except to say thank you. I'm glad to meet you. I'm glad of the opportunity to talk about Ivan. I hope people will read the book. I hope conversations will develop from it.
I think there's so much in this book. I mean, there's so much that you explicate on lesser known works that I think are really primed for their moment in the sun now. So I would hope that those conversations begin to happen, and perhaps we can have more of them at the Stoa. I would love that.
I hope so.
It's great to meet you, David. I'll tag in Peter.
Thank you, Amy. Bye.
Thank you, Amy, and thank you, David, for coming to the Stoa. I got no closing announcements. Unless Benita, do you want to plug your event coming up? No, she's a really awesome event coming up on
I
Wednesday.
don't remember what the name of it is, so just you go ahead.
Okay, there's an event you can check on the Stoa on itself. Yeah, if any events for people wanting to check out the Stoa, you go to thestoa.ca. You can check out more there. So David, Amy, everyone, thank you so much for coming to the Stoa today.
Thank you.